Um, Moving on to, and it sort of picks up on the point about, I suppose, co-design and language and narrative. And I know that you're a big advocate on common language construction.
Yeah.
And tangentially, I know that Keon, you're a big reframing guy in inverted commas as well. And I think there's some nice touch points here. So just on that point, so you've written about that common language construction. So maybe for some Mungos, how can we support staff with lived experience in shaping that language rather than just adapting it?
So you're talking now on the level of staff?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, one of the things is, I'm thinking about a chapter I wrote in a book, Pre-Treatment in Action, where it kind of talks about the importance of PI, open dialogue, and pre-treatment, how we can kind of combine those three approaches towards setting up what I would call like a really good culture for staff. And the question is, how do we build that culture? How do we build that reflective practice? And of course, communication is at the center of it. So, it's engagement, it's dealing with the power issues that play out on staff. So really when we talk about our work with the people we're meeting outside that are in need, or we're seeing them as in need of some help perhaps, and we're trying to offer that assistance in a meaningful way. It's a similar process in our work in the domain of staff. In other words, we're trying to get to the point of true dialogue, just like we are with the people outside. It's all human, all too human is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't really, like pre-treatment is kind of like that. You can apply it sort of anywhere because it's really about developing this common language and connection and leveling out things through dialogue. But just know that it's human, all too human, that we bump into these situations where there's hierarchy, where there's even if you didn't, let's say, have the peer or lived experience folks working there, there'd be a hierarchy anyways with, let's say, like the medical people versus the social workers. You know what I mean? It's in there. It's kind of reflective maybe of our society or who we are. So it's really something that coming in is there. What I like about common language is I talk a lot about the different houses of language and then the playground of language. So the playground of language is all about facilitating good communication. But we got to start with understanding there's all these different houses of language. So there's the house of language of the person in need that we're trying to help. There's the house of language of the social worker. There's the house of language of the nurse. There's the house of language of the doctor. They all come with a different kind of training and sort of values around that training and why they think it's important and an expertise that maybe they're excited to share. So they're coming in with that house of language thinking that's the answer. That's the really helpful thing. So if I'm a psychiatrist, maybe I'm speaking a house of language of diagnosis and medication. That's where I'm coming from. That's my training. I've learned all about the brain and all of this. If I'm coming in the house of language of someone with lived experience, you guys can tell me about that, but that's a way different house of language than what I just talked about that a psychiatrist is bringing to the table. So I think it's more of a house of language of community, of connection with others, of valuing people and their stories, and also a house of language that shares a certain type of set of experiences, maybe not exactly, but shares the experience of knowing what it's like to be powerless, knowing what it's like to be stigmatized, knowing what it's like to be offered things and not feeling good about the way these things are being offered, knowing the limitations or the difficulties with treatment protocols and things like that. So anyways, you guys can speak better than me to all of that. But the point is you have that in common with the folks we're trying to help. And that's an important lens for people to see the work through. So if you're creating this environment for staff, it's important from the get-go to talk about that the different people are bringing diverse perspectives based on their training, based on their experience. And we want to begin by maybe just having conversations about the importance of these different perspectives. It's not that, the way I would see it, it's not that one perspective is right and the other one's wrong. It's about that these are sort of layering of different perspectives that all can be, at the right time, helpful in their own way. So that would be my bias coming in. I would look at it that way. And so with my staff, and if I have, on all of my staff, I've had, people with experts from experience, or we call them peers a lot in the States. So sometimes I'll slip into that language saying peer, the peer worker. That's an expertise. and we need to honor it in that way. So I think, first of all, it's beginning with that kind of understanding and discussion and dialogue just about that, the different houses of language, the different lens it gives us, the different perspectives, and how all those different perspectives can offer something different in the helping process. Now, some things like the peer work, I would argue, is really important. It's important all along, but it's really important out front, because when you're getting to know people and welcoming people in, that's not the place where we want to be over labeling, stigmatizing, diagnosing, doing all of that. We want to be welcoming, connecting to people's humanness, understanding people's stories, figuring out what's important to them and setting up goals with them. So it's a co-production, as you said. So those skills and that work, I think, comes a lot out of the peer work you do. I think it comes a lot out of the pre-treatment that I talk about as well, from all of my experiences with people that I've met, living outside, and the lessons they've taught me over the years. I mean, it really comes out of that. Now, in terms of facilitating dialogue, it gets into now, how do we have a good communication, and how do we get to the point of, first of all, making the time and place to communicate on these things, and then finding within the mission maybe of the program and the different languages that are spoken, the peer language, the medical language, how they fit into that mission. Like to have a discussion about that, and to be thinking about the process of the work and where your expertise fits within that process or throughout it, on what levels. And I think that can open up meaningful dialogue. So people can talk about a situation. Maybe there's a medical concern and you got a nurse there, and they pipe in on that level of the issue. And maybe you're picking up that there's a concern about engagement, and there's a concern about the person even being contemplative, like they're pre-contemplative perhaps of the medical thing that the person is, or the mental health thing that the person is diagnosing. And so is there room then in your reflective practice and how that gets formulated within the organization to say, let's hear from the nurse on this. Let's hear the peer perspective on this. And it's not that they're necessarily in conflict. Like I said, they could be just different layers of the work. And it could be that maybe we're going to get to the medical intervention, but not first, because first we need to do some good upfront work around engagement, around setting goals, around that co-production piece. And within that, that might include the nurse then coming out to see the person and doing something, just as an example.
Food for thought there. So yeah, I think my first takeaway is around that expertise piece. So I identify as somebody who has lived experience, but and then I've heard myself being referred to as an expert by experience as well. But I think I'm more a sort of facilitator. It's almost like I'm a trust gateway from a frontline sort of services perspective. And it almost feels like now you've spelled it out into the house of languages and the playground of language, it's almost like I've toe-dipped in that playground of language and been a translator into these different houses of language to help the person sort of join the dots a little bit. That underneath it all is underpinned by, I suppose, a safety and well-being plan, which we have at St Mungo's from an internal perspective. But I think my biggest takeaway from your comment, Jay, is around there is no separation between your staff and your clients, so the people you support and the people we're asking to support, the people we support, and there is no separation. I think that you're right, is that people come to us because, again, they use us as a trust gateway. So I've had that from a client perspective, and now myself, Ashley and Keon, we are also being the trust gateway for staff as well to express themselves and meet us in that sort of level playing field when it comes to meaningful dialogue. I don't know what you think, Ashley, but Jay's helped me kind of reframe that and reformulate it almost.
I think it just has been really affirming of what I've always felt. And then maybe it's because I have lived experience, but even being in a position of management, I don't deal with staff in I'm your manager, you're my member of staff line report perspective. I deal with them as you're a human being, you're an adult, you come to work, but you're also valued here and your well-being is important to me. And using policies that are there as guidelines as a way to support members of staff rather than a way to penalize members of staff. And I think we're touching on this in the Lived Experience Network, where we're talking about cultural competency, which Keon has led the way in this language between staff and the culture that we're creating, and how we're expecting people who have lived experience or even don't to leave all of themselves at the door when they get here, and it's just not something that's humane. You know, we all bring parts of our outside lives into work, and actually we spend so much time here. It should be the place where we are met with empathy, where we are met with support, where we are met with understanding, because we're at the core of it just human beings. So that was just reaffirming that we're on the right path in what we're doing in the network, and trying to, as Leon said, be the gateway of trust between staff and the organization. So thank you so much, Jay.
If I could just add to that, you made me think of the supervision that we do. The ideal is for it to be co-vision, not super. And so it's like a co-production, like you would do with your client in that way. And I talked about houses of language in regard to people's field of expertise, what their training is, but there's also a house of language in terms of their lives that they bring into the office as well. So it's the lessons they've learned, the values they have, why this work is meaningful and important to them, what they see as their strengths in the field, how they think they could help best. And, you sort of learn that really with our staff, instead of just trying to give them like a cookbook way of doing the work and saying, this is how it's done, this is the right way to do it, there's a lot of individualization. So what I like about pre-treatment is it's very general principles, but allows for the individualization and creativity of the staff member to use their strengths in the field. And we can, through the supervision or co-vision process, begin to identify like who's a good match for, working with certain people, or different things that can be tried. Like I had one person who's like very good in the arts, that's their thing. And if they're working with young adults who are really into hip hop, they're not shy about getting into making beats and raps and people talking about their lives and that kind of thing. So it's a great engagement tool. It's a very therapeutic kind of thing to do. It's an outlet and all of that, but it's also a way of going deeper with someone, right? Because they're rapping then about something that's right here, and they see that you really took interest in their world. But the worker, allowing the worker to do that is also an innovation. And then the worker feels, wow, you really took interest in my world. You see what I'm saying? So it's that kind of piece. With pre-treatment, it's 5 basic principles. So we go from, relationship building to the common language development piece to supporting transitions, or learning how people have transitioned in the past or what's working for them now in terms of that. So it's the whole process, human process of transition and adaptation, the different environments, people, it could be the weather, whatever it is. And then there's promoting safety. And through that, we look at through a harm reduction lens and a crisis intervention lens in terms of promoting safety. I think of a lot of the people like experts from experience, at least in the States, one of the big areas is harm reduction work that I see people doing and doing it really well. So, that's another area where promoting safety, I think, is really big. And then I like the change model stuff, the stages to that, and motivational interviewing. So facilitating positive change is the 5th principle. But within that, we're not really exactly telling you how to do it. We're saying these are the 5 sort of guiding principles to the work. Now, how do you bring a staff member with certain talents and a person who's asking for some assistance or outreaching to and discovering their talents and strengths, and then bringing that to a co-production and letting it kind of unfold? That's the beauty of relationships, right?
Yeah, it's the gift and the curse of relationships, and it's also the understanding, Jay, that it's going to be peaks and troughs. There's ebbs and flows. Sometimes you'll zig, but you should have zagged as well. But I think what's important is that there's authenticity within that, and I think there's always room, especially in the relationships that I've had with staff, whether it be Ashley, Keon, or with clients that I've had, and I suppose like you and Butch as well. It's never going to be a straight line. It's going to be non-linear, right?
Yeah.
You put yourself on mute.
I just wanted to bring Keon in because you took yourself off mute. I don't know if you had any thoughts as well you want to add on that.
Yeah, I know my internet's terrible though, so apologies.
Good.
But I was just gonna say 2 things that really struck me, or lots of things that struck me. But I was gonna ask you about thresholds a little bit, like the things that make us uncomfortable to engage in that. It's not co-supervision, but my brain I'm already so much in supervision that my brain can't really take the super out of it. But like as someone with lived experience, I always think that one of the noticeable things when I think about language is the thresholds that people with lived experience have are often a lot, I don't know if they're higher or whatever, but like there's a kind of tolerance of more because of your lived realities, what you've lived through. And I'm wondering about what sort of barriers you've come across like over the 3 decades of working with embedding that commonality of language? Because I can only imagine it can make people feel very uncomfortable. Like people don't want to, obviously also people don't want to make mistakes. So how have you seen that embedded when it's been embedded well? Very broad question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Well, I'm working with an organization right now. It's called Craig's Doors, and they've actually, in terms of their hiring and what they do, they're often getting people uh, that are either the director of the program or the supervisors in the program or the case managers that are coming in with a certain level of expertise. In other words, some of them have sort of the book knowledge and they've gone to college or whatever, and they have a degree in social work or whatever it is. But at the same time, it's people with lived experience as well. So I see that as like a really powerful mix. I think one of the questions is when I'm working with staff that have lived experience and I have staff that have other types of experience, of course, they have their own life experiences too that also, by the way, of course, connect to the work and what we do. It's not, everyone's been through some trauma and loss and difficult times, and we draw off of that. So part of the common language is, first of all, I think realizing that whole piece. At the same time, I think the people that we're employing, let's say, as peer workers, I feel like that shouldn't be an end in itself. In other words, they can still be peer, but the question is it built into the program that if the person decides to go, let's say, for social work degree, will they be paid on the level then of having a social work degree, while also if they continue in that peer role? Or is there another role that's offered to them? Might be another way to think about it as well. So I think, some of it is having like a certain amount of equity in terms of how people are treated. Like I've worked for one organization where all of the people that were doing the peer work, they had to punch in for every shift and punch out, where the other people were salaried. So that was like an obvious difference. So the question is, how do we kind of hold these different approaches on a similar level and have that reflected within our organization? And then in terms of the conversation, a lot of it is making the space for the dialogues to happen. So I don't know, some organizations are not very good at that. They don't have a regular reflective practice meeting with their staff. They don't have maybe like a weekly team meeting where you're having all the different disciplines represented on that team. And then the question is, how does self-care play into this? That's really important. So I find that what I like about us having more of a peer worker piece to what we do, one of the good things it also brings is self-care for everybody. In other words, people are thinking, oh, we have people with, a lot of like trauma in their histories, and you're coming, as a peer coming in, and what does the self-care look like? But really, that's needed for all the staff. And it's almost like it gave permission to look at this in a broader way for everybody, like how we use our sick time, how we cover for each other, and so this agency I was initially talking about, Craig's Doors, they kind of had like all these layers to the work in terms of you would have 2 or 3 people involved in running a team that was a team themselves, or you'd have 2 or 3 people that were involved in directing the agency. So like if one person was overwhelmed or having a hard time or feeling triggered or just needed a break, there was other people that could cover, but they all within their teams had a good common language and mission and sensibility about what they were doing and how they were doing things. So when someone covered, it wasn't just now we're doing it this guy's way. There was a philosophy behind it, in other words. So I think that's another way to sort of manage and to build in something that could be lasting. But even myself, the hiring I did through the years, most of the people I hired had lived experience. So even if I was hiring people with degrees, I'd kind of look for that. But then the next question in my mind would be around the stability and the support for that person on the team and the environment being an environment that really works for people in that way. And there's no magic number like, oh, you've been sober 3 years or, something like that. It's really about the support system and the way the work is set up, the expectations that we're in this as a team and we're supporting, one another. And this is valuable to do. I mean, the other thing I get out of people coming in with lived experience is this sense of optimism. The productivity. I see people with lived experience being sometimes a little more intense, but often more productive. You know, they're driven to reach out and meet people and be of help. And sometimes you don't see it on that level with the other staff. And then you see it in their numbers. Their numbers, are really good as a result. But the question is, are they in a role within your organization that they can do well and take advantage? And also, is there enough reflective practice and support where you could still talk about some things like boundaries, or if you're trying to be a savior, like you're trying to save people and putting yourself in unsafe situations, like that kind of stuff has to be looked at, but it has to be looked at through a trusting relationship and a reflective practice. So I think those are the kinds of things that are best, setting up those layers.
Yeah. And like you said, that's one of the things that introducing that scaffolding benefits everybody. I was going to ask you, was that intuitive for you in the beginning, or did you notice it as you went along that when you implemented things for the benefit of people who lived the experience, that just all of the staff benefited as well?
I had a really good first experience in the field in the 1980s. Before, we didn't really use the words peer or lived experience, but I worked for a place called Manhattan Bowery Corporation in New York City. And we knew we were hiring people with hands-on experience, people in recovery, that kind of thing, and people who had been homeless themselves. We just didn't have really a term for it. And they actually came onto our team initially as like a van driver. Like they drove the van and for us to go to places to do the outreach, but then also to help support transitions of clients to different appointments and things like that. But then it turned out that these same van drivers, some of them spoke Spanish, so they were literal interpreters for people we were meeting that was Spanish speaking. And then the more we talked to them, we realized they knew the terrain. From being homeless, they knew where people were. They literally knew some people who were out there on the streets and shelters. So then they became someone that would support the transitions to our team, to the other team members. They would do more of the upfront meeting, hello, hey, you know me. And they were also our eyes and ears on the ground in terms of safety. So if we were doing outreach as a team of 3, sometimes one person would sit back a little bit. Often it was what we now call the peer, would be sitting back, but they'd be listening and looking and observing and making sure the environment was safe around us. Or sometimes they would do the first approach and we would sit back and do the safety thing. So I basically learned in this early experience of working with people that didn't have a degree and were so essential to our team and making things work. And so by valuing that, it was easy for me, I think, to continue to utilize that in my work going forward. I wasn't in charge of the team. I was just a social worker on the team. There was a team lead, but it was pretty, I found it more interesting to meet the people that were driving the vans and to connect with them and hear their stories. And I was into fishing and we do like fishing trips and stuff like that. So I was getting to know the guys that way as well. Yeah, so I don't know. That's just where it went for me. Kind of organic, really.
And yeah, it seems to me, just sorry, before handing back over to Ashley, again, there's some really key outreach learning there that's Keon touched upon. It seems to me, has been kind of intuitive, and there's that situational risk bit. And I think the nuance in support services, and I've said this a couple of times, is knowing when to push and knowing when to sit back as well. And I think that works from a people management, staff perspective, client perspective, but even in my own life, sometimes I'm keen to get on, and coming from a lived experience background, I've wasted X amount of time in my life because I was wasting it doing other things. Now I'm here, I'm in a rush to get things done quickly. And sometimes I have to check myself, breathe a little, step back and let things pan out, as you say, Jay, organically. Ashley.
Yeah, I think what you said is so important, because we can't put down on paper or in textbooks how to adapt that side of delivering a service. You have to be out in the field to pick up on those things. And like Keon was asking, if it's intuitive, and I think a lot of it is intuitive, but it doesn't always translate into the workplace, like when we're thinking about how we build frameworks around what outreach looks like or how we deliver a service. It's all like, oh, this is step by step how it should be, but actually we need to be able to adapt and to be flexible depending on the needs of the people that we're trying to serve. So I think that was super important. I think you touched on a few things that we were looking to get a little bit more insight about around the unexpected benefits of having lived experience staff come on board in services. So you touched on, them being able to be the eyes and the ears that you wouldn't necessarily have if you were approaching it from a different perspective. And you also slid into the human side of recovery, essentially like what happens when organizations do have that perspective of how important it is to have lived experience staff involved in recovery.